Okay, guys, welcome to your last week of schoolwork before the final. So there is nothing else after you finish this week except for that final. So once you're done, you're done. So if you get this done early, good on you. But this should take you through May 1st if you're following it kind of on schedule. But let's go ahead and look at what I'm having you guys do for this last week of coursework. So we'll go ahead and click on courses. We're going to go back to first hour here. And I like it because, first hour has this motto, we can do it. And you guys can do it. We're almost done. I'm very proud of you guys for dealing with these changes. But here you go. I want you to go ahead and click on Unit 8. This is where we're at, and you will note that we now have a new folder, a yellow folder called Civil Rights, the Rise of Conservatism, and the End of the Cold War. So we're basically going to be ending this course in 1991. Now, if we go ahead and click on this, you will see that there are 5 assignments. 2 of them are quizzes, so these are actually bonded together. Even though it looks like there's 7, there's actually 5 assignments. So let's talk about the first one. The first one is called Civil Rights and Photos, so we're going to be talking about the Civil Rights Movement. Now, the Civil Rights Movement traditionally has focused very much on African Americans and African Americans and their struggle, why there were other groups as well that fought for theirs. We will talk about that in a little bit. But anyways, so you have here your assignment. Now we need to remember that when we talk about the African American Civil Rights Movement, it was actually a century-long fight for civil rights after the end of the Civil War. There were 3 major waves. The one that most students and people think of when we think of civil rights is the Civil Rights Movement of the 60s with Martin Luther King Jr. And Malcolm X. And that's what we're looking at here. But there was that major movement in the late 1800s, and then another rise with Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois in the 1920s. But we're looking at the 50s, 60s, and 70s here. So what I want you guys to do is watch this video. Now this is a longer video. This is about 28 minutes, talking about the Civil Rights Movement. It's kind of interesting. It gives the Civil Rights Movement from both point of views. So this gives you the necessary background to go ahead and do the assignment. So we're going to look at the assignment here. So you'll just click on this. This is another one of those PDFs. In this one, you're looking at 3 photographs. The first one deals with this high school student attending a segregated high school for the first time. Remember, segregated high schools was you had a high school for whites, you had a high school for African Americans, and they did not mix. And due to Brown versus the Board of Education, high schools were integrated, which is the opposite of segregated. And now that's kind of what we have. We have whites, we have blacks, we have Hispanics. Everybody's kind of mixed and matched in school. The next one, this is a photograph from a newspaper from Sacramento, California. These are members of the Black Panther Party. These were African Americans who felt that violence was the only way to obtain civil rights, not the non-violence of Martin Luther King Jr. And so they're carrying weapons into the state capitol in California. And then the last one, these are African American students from Howard University, not Harvard, Howard, which is a traditional black school. Now notice they have these ropes hanging around their necks. These are portrayals of a noose. While they're not a full noose, it is very symbolic. Now please note that the noose is a symbol of violence and oppression to African Americans. And while some people say that the noose doesn't mean that much, it's not that threatening, it's very different if you're African American. We've talked about lynching in the past, how lynching was used as a way to provide community justice. It's used in every society. In English-based society, it's usually hang them from a tree. We have reports of lynching all the way back to the 600s in England, with people hung from a tree. In other countries, Iran, for example, they stone people instead of hanging them, so they throw rocks at them until they die. But this sense of community justice, where they feel like the legal government is not providing enough justice, so people take justice into their own hands, usually in a crowd or a mob, watching some kind of public execution or humiliation, but usually execution. But in the United States, this lynching is primarily aimed at the African American community. Were others lynched? Sure, but a vast majority of them were African Americans. So this rope symbol is very much tied in with the African American experience in the United States, and it's a powerful symbol for that community. So them wearing these nooses, which were not put on them by white people, in this case it was a symbol of them protesting their oppression. I want you guys to look at that. So what you're going to do, and please pay attention here because the PDF is not 100% correct. What I want you to do is first do round one. I want you to look at the 3 documents and tell me what are the clues in the documents, just in the picture, about when this was made. And I want you to roughly guess the decade. Was this the 1950s? Was it the 1960s? Was it the 1970s? Was it earlier? And tell me why. So what are your clues and when was it? Do it for document A, B, and C. Pretty easy. Now, the next part, it says group decision, round 2. We're not doing groups because we're doing stay at home and practicing social distancing. So what I want you to do is, this is solo decision. Okay, I want you to decide which document was created first, which one was second, and which one was last, and tell me why. Pretty easy. I do not want you to do this. Do not do this. See my wiggly cursor? Don't do this. Okay? This would require a group discussion, and we're not doing it. So don't do round 3. All right. So that's easy peasy enough. So let's go to back to the folder here. All right, the Civil Rights Act. So in the 1960s, both President Kennedy and President Johnson felt the need that they had to legislate equality in the United States, and this ultimately culminated in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is still the law of the land. And this prevents, and interestingly, Schoology blocks some of these words, so I'm going to go ahead and explain this. So it prevents discrimination based off of race, color, sex, religion, or national origin. So you cannot discriminate or can't give somebody less money because they're a different race, or you can't prevent someone from obtaining a job because they're a different sex or a different religion or national origin, or even prevent them from housing. So if you're a landlord, you can't say, I don't rent to black people or Mexicans or whites or men or women. You have to create equality there. Now, interestingly enough, the word sex was added to this law by a congressman who was opposed to it because he felt if the word sex was in the law, no one would vote for it. Originally, the law was written with the word gender instead of sex. Now, this act has been added upon by the judicial action, both federal and state courts, all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, to include prohibitions against sexual harassment, gender stereotyping. This censorship right here is LGBT orientation, LGBTQ, or gender identity. So what I want you guys to do is go ahead and look through this slide. It gives you some information. And then I want you to open up this document set. Now what you're going to do here is you're going to read a variety of speeches and documents. There's a whole bunch of them. So first we have JFK's acceptance speech. So when John F. Kennedy was nominated for the presidency, I'm sorry, I have a runny nose because of allergies. When JFK was accepted as the Democratic nominee in 1960, he gave this speech about equality. He uses a term called the New Frontier. Kennedy in 1963 gave a televised address. This was just a few months before he was assassinated, about African American voting rights and giving the federal government greater power to control this. So you'll read this. In 1962, President Kennedy, I'm actually going to pause this and I'll be right back. All right, sorry for that pause. I had to go blow my nose. Anyways, so this document here is an article that Martin Luther King Jr. wrote about Kennedy, and saying that Kennedy was not doing enough to actually end discrimination, especially in housing. John Lewis was the leader of what's called SNCC. Right here you can see this, SNCC. It stood for Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee. This was a group of young people, both African American and white, later became primarily African American, where students, specifically college students, fought for equal rights. And John Lewis gave this speech at the same time and place as Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. So there was a big protest in 1963 in Washington, D.C. John Lewis gave this speech talking about civil rights, specifically with jobs. Now this is the Detroit Tribune again. Detroit was becoming a major hub for African American community in the North, and so they're writing about how President Kennedy is postponing creating equality in jobs, in housing, in order to get Southern Democrat votes. So what I want you guys to do is go ahead and read through those documents and answer these questions. It's pretty simple. You guys have done this all year. No big deal. All right. So then we have LBJ and the Great Society. So we go ahead and click on this. The Great Society was Lyndon Baines Johnson, or LBJ, who was Kennedy's vice president, who became president after his assassination. LBJ did a lot of things. That Civil Rights Act, he fought a lot of the Vietnam War, made it much, much bigger, increased the draft size. But one thing he did was he wanted to end poverty. He felt that poverty was creating inequality in the United States, and he wanted to end it. Now, this is kind of interesting. Yes, he's a Democrat, and yes, we see Democrats wanting to help the poor, and that's a traditional trope. But please remember, in the 1920s, those three Republican presidents of the 1920s, their goal was also to end poverty. In fact, President Hardie, when he won the election, said poverty is going to be over. In the next 4 years, there will be no more poor in the United States. And if you look at the 1920s, everything was going pretty awesome. The Republicans felt that the way to end poverty was laissez-faire economics, lack of government regulation, and kind of let the market take care of itself. Very much that free market capitalism that we've talked about all year. However, we know that didn't work because we had the Great Depression. So the Democrats, when they finally get back in power, and they have substantial power in the 1960s, they try to flip that dynamic, that instead of having it as free market economics with laissez-faire and lack of regulation, they go and over-regulate. And this over-regulation can be seen in LBJ's Great Society, where he is going to use government power to end poverty. While we know that's not successful, we still have poor people. It changes a lot of things, and most of these laws, if not all, are still on the books and still affect us today. So what you'll do is you'll go ahead and click on this document, and this one is in a Google Doc, so you'll click File, make a copy, and then you can type on this yourself. Now step one is I want you to watch this video about LBJ, and if you notice there's no arrow here to watch this, so there's two ways you can watch this video. You can click this link down here, which will take you to YouTube, or if you click it here, double click, it'll take you to this drawing page, and you can click it here and watch it. Either way works. They're the same video. So after you watch that video, answer these two questions. You'll just go ahead and start typing in here. Next, I would like you to read LBJ's Great Society speech. This is a modified version of it. The whole speech itself is very long. I'm not going to have you read an entire presidential speech because presidents can be very long-winded. And then answer these three questions. What kind of document is this? So is this a book? Is this a diary? Is it a letter? You tell me. What is the main message? And what sort of programs do you think that LBJ would support based off of this? Next, I want you to read about the Great Society programs, and I actually bumped that document underneath the questions, so the questions are right here, the document is right here. Which of these programs have you heard of? So before this lesson, I'm sure you guys have heard at least one. Which ones do you think have been successful, and how would you measure that success? So how would you know that it's done what it's meant to do? And then, how is the Great Society like the New Deal? Remember, FDR was also a Democratic president that used government regulation and government control to try to fix an economy and end poverty. So how is the New Deal, which we looked at before the break, how is it similar to the Great Society? And then how is it different? So you will type your answers in there. And the last one, you are going to do a compare and contrast. Now, I mentioned at the very beginning of this video that your final is the next thing that's coming up. Your final is very much like the one we did in December, where you're going to look at a variety of sources and write an essay about a topic and a compelling question. So this is kind of doing the same thing. So you have one from Joseph Califano and Thomas Sowell. Sowell, I think, is actually how you pronounce that. But I'm just going to call them Joe and Tom. So once you read these pro and con documents, so one of these guys thought the Great Society was a great idea, and one of them thought it was a terrible idea. So what I want you to do is tell me what the main argument is for each of them. So tell me their thesis. This is factual. You guys should all kind of have the same answer. Tell me what are some supporting details. This is also factual. Now, these last two are opinion. Remember, in most of your assignments, I'm not asking for a fact, I'm asking for an opinion. And more importantly, can you back up your thoughts with stated facts? So which one of these two guys, Joe or Tom, do you guys feel are more convincing, or which one do you think make a better argument? And then tell me why. Don't just write Joe and then be done. It's Joe because, or Tom because, etc., etc. And then how are their arguments about the role of government in economic recovery playing out today? So for the past 4 weeks, we've seen our economy kind of go down real fast. Some of you may even have parents who've lost their jobs, or you have family members who have, or you know friends whose family members have lost their jobs and they're struggling. So what role does government play in stimulating an economic recovery? And do the arguments that these two guys make, are they still relevant in 2020 as opposed to the 1960s and 70s? So this is Joe. He is a pro guy. He said the Great Society was awesome. Tom says it's not, that war on poverty and the Great Society was a terrible idea. So go ahead and figure out what this is and just answer these questions. All right, so let's go back to these assignments. Now, I'm actually going to be really kind to you guys. There were other civil rights movements going on during the civil rights era. It wasn't just about African Americans. If we were in class, I would actually show you guys this movie, Cesar Chavez, this guy who fought for Latino and farm worker rights in California. Please note that Cesar Chavez was not Mexican. He was born in Yuma, Arizona. His family has been in the United States since the United States took over Yuma in 1848. So he was American to the core. He was just Hispanic or Latino. So if you guys can watch this movie, it's awesome. It's on Amazon, it's on iTunes, Google Play, etc. You can rent it, you can buy it. It's a pretty good movie. The Stonewall riots, this is the beginning of the LGBT civil rights movement. New York police shut down some gay clubs in New York. The gay community started rioting, and this is when the LGBTQ community started fighting for their rights. This is kind of the beginning of it. And the last one is about the Equal Rights Amendment, which was an attempt during second wave feminism for women to obtain the constitutional guarantees of equality, even more importantly than, say, the Equal Rights Act of 1964. This was an attempt to actually write a constitutional amendment that would make it illegal to have any kind of gender discrimination. However, this amendment was not passed at the time, and when they wrote the amendment, it actually had a time limit by when it could be approved. Even though enough states have now approved it, it is past the time. So this is a PBS NewsHour quick little video about the ERA. So all right, so if you guys want, please look into these other civil rights movements. That'd be awesome. Now, as a direct result of many of the social changes that occurred and government changes that occurred in the 1960s, so in the 1960s we had hippies, we had the sexual revolution, we had second wave feminism, the ending of the kind of the traditional family and all that. There was a pushback from part of the American population that wanted to go back to what they classified as more traditional values. And we call this the rise of conservatism. We see this in conservative parties rising, a dramatic shift on who each political party received their base from. The Republican base very much shifted. The Democratic base very much shifted. And so this is called the rise of conservatism. And so some of you, and I'm looking at one particular student in 4th hour, and you know who you are. This is your last John Green video. Yeah, you can all let out a cheer now. I know how much you guys love John Green. So he talks about the rise of conservatism during kind of LBJ's presidency with Barry Goldwater from the great state of Arizona, up to the election of Richard Milhous Nixon, who was a very famous anti-communist crusader during the McCarthy era. But interestingly enough, opened up U.S. relations with communist China, which enabled U.S. manufacturing firms to send their jobs to China. So now everything says made in China, but that didn't happen until after Nixon. But anyways, I want you guys to watch this video about the rise of conservatism in the United States. Please be aware John Green has a lot of bias, and he gets a little snarky, especially a little more than normal. But once you're done with that, I want you to answer these questions, and I try to keep these questions as factual as possible. I don't think there's any opinion questions in here. I'm looking at very specific events that occurred during this rise of conservatism. All right, so ultimately this leads us to the end of the Cold War. The ultimate symbol of conservatism until very recently was this guy, Ronald Reagan, Saint Ron. I love this guy. I love Reagan so much. He's so awesome. Anyways, Reagan ended the Cold War. He got together with Mikhail Gorbachev. He is the premier of the Soviet Union. He's very famous for his birthmark here on the top of his little bald head. Sorry, guys, you're going to have to excuse me. I keep having allergies. I need to go take a Zyrtec. Zyrtec? I think that's an allergy med. Whatever the allergy med is. All right, we'll call it Benadryl. Anyways, so they got together. They started ending the nuclear arms race, reducing the total amount of nuclear weapons from close to 100,000 between both of these countries down to each side only having about 20,000, which is still enough to destroy the entire planet. But hey, you got to start somewhere. But ultimately, Reagan, through his speeches, through his words and his laws he created and rebuilding the U.S. military, actually ended up bankrupting the Soviet Union, which caused the Soviet Union to collapse. There was lots of struggles. Gorbachev was trying to introduce some market reforms and introduce some free market policies into the Soviet economy that ultimately ended up collapsing them. The Berlin Wall, which you can see here, which was a symbol of the division of Europe between a communist East and a democratic West, fell. Germany reunited, and ultimately all Soviet-backed states, so Russia, Poland, East Germany, Hungary, and some other ones around the world, with the exception of Cuba, all collapsed. While China, North Korea, and Southeast Asia remained communist, as well as Cuba, the United States ended up being the big winner of the Cold War. And that led to, in the 1990s and the 2000s, or the aughts, as I've seen written, for about 20 years, we were the world's sole superpower, and we could do whatever we wanted. During the Cold War, we had to balance the United States versus Russia, Russia versus the United States. Neither side could do exactly what they wanted. They had spheres of influence, so the closer you were to Russia, more Russia had power. The closer you were to the United States, the more the U.S. had power. And then there were some areas like Sub-Saharan Africa and parts of the Pacific that neither side 100% controlled. So they had this conflict, but now we get rid of Russia. And so the United States is the world's sole superpower until the 20-teens. And today, when we see the rise of China as a global superpower, and the U.S. can't do exactly what it wants without taking diplomacy into effect because we worry about a conflict with China or Chinese interest. Some people have even said that starting in about 2016, 2017, we've entered a new Cold War of U.S. and U.S. interest against China and Chinese interest. It's not quite the same as this, but close enough. So anyways, watch the video. Not a John Green video. And then I want you to answer the question, and this is the last assignment you're doing for me for this year, with the exception of the final. So once you're done, you're done. So in this one, instead of multiple choice, it is a short answer. In your own words, explain how the Cold War ended and how the U.S. won it. You must have 4 pieces of evidence from either the video or outside sources. If you do use outside sources, and I know what's in the video, so I'll know, I need a full citation. Give me the link from the website you took it from. If I don't see that, I will dock points. All right, so that's it. That's the end of all coursework with the exception of the final. I will post the final on May 4th. You really need to pay attention to the video. I might have some mandatory Zoom meetings. I'm still debating that to explain the final. That final is not just a multiple choice question. So I will let you guys know, but right now you're done. That's it. So go ahead and make sure you are finishing up all 3 folders here. Then you're done. This will take you through May 1st or whenever you guys are done. So I hope you guys are all staying safe. I hope you're washing your hands, practicing proper social distancing. Let's kind of flatten this curve. I want to see all of you in the fall. I do miss you guys. I miss our banter. I miss your guys' everything, your foibles, your good things, your bad things, all that. So I want to see you guys in the fall. So stay safe. And that's it. Thanks. Bye.